On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, allowing women to vote, but generations of women after them continued to fight to gain equal rights. In the 1920s, women participated in World War I, and they proved to many that they deserved equal rights. Women like Susan B. Anthony, who was an American writer, lecturer, and abolitionist, led women in the voting rights movement and started the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Because of women like her and many others, the 19th Amendment was passed, allowing women to vote in 1920. With these rights secured for women, they started what was known as the second wave of feminism. In the 1930s, women's equality was not as important of a problem as previous decades, but some progress was made. The rise of airplanes led to the prominence of some well-known strong women such as Amelia Earhart, who was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean and the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. However, when the Great Depression hit, it was hard for many Americans to find jobs, let alone a woman. This led to the idea that homemaking was the only job suitable for a woman. In the 1940s, women gained even more employment options such as factories and mechanic work, as men left to fight in World War II. When men returned back home, they took their old jobs back, forcing the women who filled those positions to move into typist and secretary jobs. This further showed inequality. However, as different jobs became women positions while others were reserved for men. In the early 60s, the book Feminine Mystique was written by Betty Friedan. It was about white women's situations in the 50s and 60s. Betty Friedan was the first president of the NOW, National Organization for Women group. This group included many clubs all over towns, discussing problems they faced as a woman. Women started to feel less alone. Eventually, two groups were formed. Women's Liberation in the early stages were made up of young radical women in the cities and colleges. The other group was Betty Friedan's ideal group. This didn't include lesbians and black women joining her idea of the liberation movement. Soon, the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1963 by Lyndon B. Johnson. It ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. A legal committee was formed to listen to people's discrimination complaints, deciding if they were protected by the Civil Rights Bill. Airline stewardesses in the 50s and 60s were very different than how they are today. To get the job, they had to be pretty, thin, and single. Airline stewardesses were very discriminated against. They were fired at the age of 32 because that was considered too old to keep the job. Some came together and went to the Civil Rights Committee to try to change the rule because it was discriminatory. Sadly, their complaints weren't heard. What did work with the committee is that a woman named Lorena Weeks wanted to work for a phone company as a lineman, but since she was a woman, she was not given the job because it was reserved for a man. She went to the committee, and the committee said the phone company had to give her the job. Throughout the 70s, many women marched and protested equality. For Women's Strike Day on August 26, 1970, women marched in Washington, D.C. for equal employment and educational opportunities, as well as accessible child care. One very influential woman was Gloria Steinem. She influenced the idea of joining all women together, including lesbians and blacks, but they never were fully included. Gloria Steinem became very popular and decided to create her own magazine with fellow women journalists. Only women-to-women interactions, not men-to-women. Gloria's magazine was named Miss, and it was first issued in 1972. Through this magazine, many women felt connected to the women's liberation movement. It talked about problems many women faced, such as domestic abuse, and didn't focus on making your husband happy and cooking like many other magazines. One of the final goals of the women's liberation movement was passing the Equal Rights Amendment, which was designed to give equal legal rights to all Americans, regardless of sex, in matters of divorce, property, and employment. Unfortunately, it did not pass, but women were still inspired to enact change. The feminist movement, especially the second wave of feminism, impacted how women are viewed today. Women now have access to greater education, more equal pay with men, the right to initiate a divorce, the right to abortion, and availability to birth control pills. Women's participation in the U.S. labor force has climbed since World War II, from 32.7% in 1948 to 58.8% in 2016. The women with college degrees in the labor force has almost quadrupled since 1970. More than 40% of women in labor force had college degrees in 2016, compared with 11% in 1970. As we've discussed, in 1920, when women gained the right to vote, we can now observe that women have gained massive political and legal strides, but there is still change to be made. If you are over the age of 18 and vote in this upcoming election, we can continue to gain even more equality and show the world how powerful women really are.